Okay, thank you, Matthew, and thank you all for coming along and joining. And just a little shout out to Michelle Hood. I've always appreciated all the assistance and advice he's given me over the years. And some of that is reflected in tonight's presentation. For many of you, you may not know where Norfolk Island is, so let's start with where is Norfolk Island. And Norfolk Island is situated between New Zealand and New Caledonia on what's called the Norfolk Ridge. This is a volcanic ridge, and as you know, the New Zealand is subject to many earthquakes and volcanic activity, but Norfolk Island has an extinct volcano. Norfolk is almost equidistant to Brisbane in Queensland, Sydney in New South Wales, and Auckland in New Zealand. So, and I just draw two other things from this map before we move on. Lord Howe Island's on a different ridge, and it's between Norfolk Island and Sydney, and the island of Tasmania will come up a little later on, originally called Van Diemen's Land. Norfolk Island itself is a bit like Pitcairn Island. It's more than one island. In this case, it's 3 islands, but only one is inhabited. The main island here is 35 square kilometers or 13.5 square miles. It's not very big at all. The main original settlement was down here in Kingston. And today, the main village is at Burt Pine. And there is a little settlement at Cascade. And that's because if the winds are blowing from the south, then you bring your boat into the north. And if the winds are blowing from the north, then you bring your ship into the south. And that's the reason for 2 landing docks. It's a very exposed island. And half of the population of Norfolk Island is related to Pitcairn Islanders. And the reason is that in the 1850s, the Pitcairn Islanders were relocated. They were running out, they were having disease. They were running into all sorts of problems on Pitcairn Island. And they requested the British government to find another place for them to be relocated. And so in 1856, the British government moved them from Pitcairn Island to the right over here across about 6,000 kilometers to Norfolk Island. So there's quite a connection between Pitcairn and Norfolk Island. Here's an early Pitcairn cover addressed to Norfolk Island. Here's a Norfolk cover addressed to Pitcairn Island. And this is what the settlement, the old convict settlement on Norfolk Island looks like today. But we'll come back to looking at that a little bit more. So for tonight, we've got a fairly large task ahead of us. We'll go through the early settlements, the period before they had their own stamps, their first stamp issue, and then the other issues that preceded decimalization in 1966. I'll look at the early decimal period, but not the later decimal period, simply because there's too much to look at. And then touch on a couple of little topics at the end, local mail, official mail, and some miscellaneous things. So that's the agenda for this evening. The first visitors were probably Polynesian. Of course, there's no postal history associated with Polynesian visitors, but they weren't settlers. So it's a little incorrect to talk about early settlements being Polynesian. There is evidence of Polynesian visitation. There's a stone laid patio type environments where houses had been built, but there's no burial grounds or anything like that. And the reason probably is that Norfolk Island was on the extreme western border of what's called the Polynesian Triangle from Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand. Here is Norfolk Island on the extreme western border. And so it was outside most of the territory that the Polynesians would have been. But they did visit, and there is evidence of that visitation. The first Westerner, of course, was Captain Cook to see Norfolk Island in 1774 on his second trip to the Pacific. And this is the map he drew with the other 2 little islands down here. The big island is called Phillip Island, by the way. As a result of that visit, Cook noticed there were tremendous trees on Norfolk Island. And in the background, I'll come back and talk about it, but the Norfolk Island pine, which is sort of hidden over here on the left, is a good example. They're very, very straight, tall trees. and he figured they'd make great masts for sailing ships. It turns out they don't, but we'll come back to that a little later on. He also saw lots of hemp growing, and at that time, British were being cut back by the Russians, and they needed hemp for sails and ropes. And so he strongly recommended a settlement on Norfolk Island to the British for both the trees and the flax on the island. Both turned out to be a bust, but we'll come back to that again later on. As a result, when the British hulks on the Thames started to really fill up with prisoners, and they started to look for penal settlements in the late 1700s, Australia was signaled out, and the first fleet was sent off to Australia in 1788. And believe it or not, Norfolk Island was also settled in 1778, because that first fleet came and settled in Sydney, Australia, and then an adjunct colony, if you like, a auxiliary settlement was to be set up on Norfolk Island so that they could get access to the trees and the hemp, the flax. So it was only about 3 months after the settlement in Australia that Norfolk Island was settled. And here's one of the very earliest pieces of postal history from Norfolk Island, written in 1802. It's a letter to Her Majesty's Treasuries in Sydney for £494, which was a lot of money in those days, to run Norfolk Island. It's been sent by Broughton and authorized by J. Faroo. Now, Joseph Faroo was one of the more vicious commandants on the island. He was commandant for 4 years, and he was the first person to hang people on Norfolk Island. Now, this auxiliary settlement, I should make clear, was a mixture of convicts from the settlement in Sydney and free people, because they wanted the settlement to become self-sustaining. And so the idea was they'd give grants of land, and the hope was that it would not only become self-sustaining, but would become a breadbasket for the main settlement in Sydney. So the first early settlement, the first penal settlement, as we call, which went from 1788 to 1825, was basically an auxiliary settlement that was designed to be both a bit of a penal settlement for the overflow from Sydney and a private producing settlement on the island. Nonetheless, the convicts did get out of hand every so often, and Mr. Foveau, this 1802, it was late 1700s, as the Irish Rebellion, and a lot of the people being sent to Norfolk Island had really not even committed a crime. They were part of the Irish Rebellion, and so the British were really worried about the Irish Rebellion coming back on Norfolk Island. So Foveau was not very good commander, though he did built a lot of public buildings out of stone on the island, and that's where a lot of the island comes from. But he was pretty vicious in his treatment of convicts. The settlement then it got to about 1,000 people by 1800. So you're talking about quite a substantial settlement on this island in 1800, but then it was wound down by 1814. And in fact, I said 1825 before, but 1814 to 1824, the island was uninhabited. The original settlement was considered a failure. It couldn't maintain itself. It was too remote. It was very difficult, very expensive to maintain. And so it was closed down. The buildings, stone buildings, were still there. They trashed a few of them, and the mills and so on, in case anyone else, like the French, wanted to settle the island. But generally, they gave up on the island. And then in 1825, its remoteness became an advantage, because they were finding that many of the convicts sent to both Australia and to Tasmania were committing additional crimes. And so Norfolk Island then became the center for all the people who committed additional crimes after they got to the penal settlements. Really the bad boys, and bad girls, I might add, of the convict, of the first fleet. And there is no postal history that I'm aware of from this second period. The period basically from 1824 to 1856. But this was when the really vicious people were treated. There were chain gangs all over the place to build roads. And the only piece of literature I've got is something like the following. And this is a fascinating document, actually. There are not many of these in private hands. It is called, it's called a conduct record. So on this record, for a particular prisoner is everything they've ever done from the beginning right through to the end. And let me show you who this conduct record was for. The conduct record for us was a guy called Abraham Crabtree. And he was sent to Van Diemen's Land, which was Tasmania, in July 1832. But in Tasmania, he had additional misdemeanors: gross neglect of duty, extorting money, refusing to work, fighting, insolence, gambling, absent from his chain gang, in liquor, etc. A rather long list of misdemeanors. And so he resulted in further punishments, and he was sent to the really bad remote community on Norfolk Island. He was removed to Norfolk Island in 1846, where he was to be handcuffed for 7 years, starting in January 1847. Now, transportation to Australia was stopped in 1841. So there are no new prisoners coming in. And even though there was a lot of prisoners on the island, in general, when they served their time, they were released and stayed and went back to Australia often and became very big entrepreneurs. But basically, the question was, should we start to cut back with settlement? And so in the end, in the 1850s, Norfolk Island was gradually phased out. The remaining prisoners were taken back to Tasmania, to Van Diemen's Land. And by 1854, the island was basically empty. But meanwhile, the Pitcairners had been to England in 1850 requesting relocation. And so the British offered them Norfolk Island, because indeed it had lots of buildings, it had dams, it had windmills, there were cows everywhere. And so it was an ideal location for the Pitcairners, almost the same latitude and not quite the same weather, I might add. So in 1856, the Pitcairners were brought to Norfolk Island. As I pointed out on the map, it was about a 5-week journey over 6,000 kilometers. And they landed on the island. Each family was given about 20 hectares or 50 acres of land. They were given houses. There were a few people left behind to show them how to till the land and where the good land was and where the waterways were. So it was a going settlement already, even though there was nobody there when the Pitcairners arrived. I think one of the lasting implications of this is the Pitcairners were told they would be given free land on the island, and they were. But the British held back about 40 or 50% of the island for the Crown. And of course, the idea was that that's where they would establish Crown lands, maybe for timber, whatever. Now, the reason that the big Norfolk Island pines, before I move on to the Pitcairn community, the Norfolk Island pines turned out to be no good for ship masts is that the branches of the pines knot into the main stem. And therefore, when you take the branch off it, it leaves a little indentation in the main stem of the tree. And that's a weak point. And so masts built with Norfolk Island pines, they break all the time where the branches come in. The flax, it turned out, was the wrong sort of flax for very good rope or sails. And so that was another reason why the island was closed, because it didn't give what the British wanted it to give. So we're through the second settlement, the second penal settlement, which was very nasty, into the Pitcairn Islanders settlement. And here's an early, very early, they came in, the Pitcairn Islanders came in 1856. This is a letter to the Reverend G. Nobbs in Norfolk Island, April 1860, a very early inwards letter to the island. No postal markings, because in fact, the way that mail got to the island in the last half of the 19th century, of course, was by favor of captains of boats, whether they were whalers or whatever. If they were going by the island, they were asked to drop off mail or pick up mail. And this one is indeed coming from Sydney, and it would have been carried to the island by favor, if you like. So this is a very early inwards letter. Another example of an inwards letter, although this one has some postal markings, is because it came from Frozell Park in Alton, England, 1863, into Norfolk Island, into Mr. Nobbs. And it's got the back stamps of Alton, London, and arrival in Sydney. And then from Sydney, it would have been transported out to the island. Again, an inwards cover addressed to Reverend Nobbs on Norfolk Island, Australia, originating in England with a nice Lombard Street 1868 cancel. The Reverend Nobbs was the spiritual leader of the island. He didn't start off that way. He started off as probably I don't know, mutineer in Australia, in Australia, in South America, and he came to Pitcairn Island. But over the years, he settled down. By 1850, he did go to London, England. He had a meeting with Queen Victoria, and he was ordained as an Anglican minister. So ordering stuff from the Society for Promoting Christian Knowledge is not surprising. Also, this correspondence came from an attic in one of the Norfolk Island old houses, and a lot of it is damaged and rat-eaten, but it's about the only things we have from the late part of the 19th century. Finally, here's a letter written, dated on Norfolk Island for 1870, signed by George Nobbs, and he signs himself as chaplain. And Reverend Nobbs died in 1884. As I said, he was the spiritual leader of the island, and he very much is remembered. His grave is still on the island, and I visited the island in November of 2019, and this is my photo of his grave, George Hum Nobbs. That's the headstone. The footstone with GHN has been moved up close to the headstone. That would normally be at the end of the grave. And so by 1886 the letters are coming into Mrs. Nobbs because George has passed away. The earliest cancellations that are available in the stamp marketplace, there are things that are available in museums and so on, but the earliest cancellation in the 1880s, I keep saying, in the 1880s, administration was transferred to New South Wales. I should go back. When the Islanders were brought in, when the Pitcairn Islanders were brought in, the Brits proclaimed it as a Crown colony. Up to there, it had just been an adjunct to New South Wales. But with the arrival of the Pitcairn Islanders and the relocation, that was declared a Crown colony. In the late 1890s, the responsibility was removed from the British government and transferred to the government of New South Wales. So New South Wales in the 1890s became responsible for its postal affairs and for indeed some of the proclamation of the laws on the island. And the first postal cancellation from this period is Norfolk Island, as you see in the top corner. You can just see the OLK here on the postcard. This cancel is almost always illegible. What is nice is the postcard has Norfolk Island, March the 30th, 06 for 1906. What we do see here is a big A here, and this is the Auckland, New Zealand transit mark for this postcard. This is what the island looked like at the turn of the century when it was transferred under New South Wales jurisdiction. This, by the way, of course, is a New South Wales stamp. These are the stone buildings that the convicts had built that have been resuscitated by the Pitcairn Islanders. This is the jail, by the way, down here. And the walls still exist to this day, but the interior stone had been pilfered over the years to build houses by local residents and indeed by the Pitcairners. But this is what the island looked like even by early 1900. With the transfer to Australia, to New South Wales, one of the other things that occurred on the island was the building of a cable station. Now, this introduced Norfolk Island to the rest of the world and the rest of the world to Norfolk Island. And the reason was that the cable at the time in the 1800s, the late last half of the 19th century, the cable went through Malaysia and the Middle East to England. And there was always a concern that if there was a war or that, in fact, the cable would be cut. And the argument was for, indeed, a cable to go through British countries only. And so the cable was established on what's called the red route being the countries with the color red on the maps, which are British Commonwealth countries. And in fact, the cable came through Canada. So the cable was laid from Vancouver to Fanning Island, through Fiji, down to Norfolk Island. And when it split at Norfolk Island, part of it went on to Sydney, Australia, and part went on to Auckland, New Zealand. And this became established and open in 1902. And here's a couple of covers into the cable board on Norfolk Island. And indeed, a cablegram that went to Archie Quintail. And Quintail is a very common Pitcairn name. So Norfolk Island became known to the world because of this important cable link. And in fact, the reason that it was such a good link is it came to Canada, and then the cable went through Canada and picked up the cable from Canada onto England and Europe from then on. It also cut the rates on the cable going in the other direction because they had a monopoly in before this opened in 1902, and now they no longer had a monopoly. The second main cancel, we're now into the Australian stamp period. Australia was established as a Commonwealth in 1901, and but they didn't introduce our own stamps for about a decade. The reason was they had a lot of difficulty separating out all the revenues between all the different colonial states, what are called states now in Australia, New South Wales, Victoria, Tasmania, and so on. And it took them a decade to sort out all the revenues before who got what before they had a common stamp issue. But here the next cover shows the second cancellation for the New South Wales administration, Norfolk Island, New South Wales. It's a late use. In fact, this ceased to be used by July 1914. This is May 1914. I like this cover because it's a nice clear cancel. There's an Australian kangaroo 4-penny stamp on the back, and that would have paid 1 penny for postage and 3 penny for registration, except the cover never got registered. Moving on, the next cancellation became a Norfolk Island, Australia cancellation. It was introduced in 1915. The earliest use I've got down here is 1925. This cover coming in from Fanning Island, remember Fanning Island from the cable company route, is back stamped with this cancel. And in fact, that cancel there is the back stamp on this cover, 1931. The earlier cover here in 1925 is registered, irregularly posted, as you may see lightly here. And the reason was there weren't any registration facilities on the island. So in fact, it went to New Zealand. It was registered in Auckland, New Zealand. And in fact, it pays the penny halfpenny postage with the red stamp and 3 pennies for registration with the 2 and 1 King George VI stamps. When registration labels finally came to Norfolk Island in the mid-30s, this is a 1937 cover, I think, they were blank temporary labels, and they had a big hand stamp, Norfolk Island, that went over the labels. So these are early covers from the Australian period, and both inward and outward. The rate to the USA, by the way, was higher than the rate to British Commonwealth countries. You will see it was threepence to the USA, and this country had this cover on the bottom right has a threepenny blue stamp, and then for the postage, and then 2 penny plus 1 penny making up the additional threepenny for the registration. The first aeroplane to land on Norfolk Island was carried by Francis Chichester in 1931. He came from New Zealand. He was the first person to fly over the Tasman Sea, landed on Norfolk Island, and of course it was a float plane, and he landed in the Cascade area in the north part of the island, as I showed you before. And he left on a Saturday. The post office didn't open until the Monday. So, in fact, this cover gets the cancellation of the 30th of March, 1931. And then on his way to Australia to complete the Trans-Tasman crossing, he could only had enough fuel to go as far as Lord Howe Island, and I mentioned Lord Howe Island, and then from there on to Sydney. He arrived on Lord Howe Island on the 1st of April. And unfortunately, it did turn out to be an April Fool's joke, because that night a huge storm came through and broke up his plane in the moorings. And it took him 5 or 6 months to fix it before he could fly on to Sydney. I guess he knew already that he should fix the airmail labels upside down, because he was down under, a Brit being down under. Moving on, I love these covers. This is a 1937 cover. This is a guy called Carl Lewis, does hand-painted covers from Japan. There's Phillip Island in the background. And in fact, this is the only known painting for Norfolk Island. That doesn't mean this is the only known cover. There's not very many of them, but they all have this design. And the design looks remarkably similar to a recent stamp from Norfolk Island, and that is Phillips Island in the background here from Ross Point. And so this looks very much like the picture that Carl Lewis painted on the island. Carl Lewis was an American who lived in Japan, and therefore his legacy was a lot of these watercolors that were very common in Japan in that time period. Moving on, hit 3 more covers from the George VI period. The top cover with a penny stamp. Davis Brothers were stationers, so this is a cover that probably carried the stationery, so it got a half-rate mail. This is a double-rate cover to England, and this is the 3-penny rate, 2 + 1 to the USA. Notice that a new postmark was introduced in the 1930s. It had AUST on the bottom with a period for Ost, and these 2 covers on the right show that. But the cover on the bottom, even though it's late at 1938, still shows the old postmark with the full Australia cancel. We then get to the first airmail, the Empire Airmail Scheme, which started with airmails going to Africa and then to Malaysia, and finally was extended to Australia in September 1938. So these are incoming covers to Norfolk Island, both received in 1938. These flight covers, of course, would not have been flown to Norfolk Island. There was no runway on Norfolk Island at this time. They would have been flown to Sydney, Australia, and then taken by boat into Norfolk Island. Then we get to the war period. So these are 4 covers from 1940, and you're beginning to see the introduction of the passed by censor marks. Originally, this is the 20th of April, 1940. Originally, the censor mark was put on the back of the covers. By now, the postage rate had been raised to 2 pennies, so 4 times a halfpenny is 2 pennies. This is going to Australia. And this one too, you can see that after about May, I think, May or June, they started to put the censor hand stamp on the front. This is a cover going to Tattersalls, the betting company, with a nice packet boat Sydney mark. There were, as it turns out, 3 censors passed by Censor 1. Censor 1 was located in the administrator's office, and this is a very difficult censor mark to get, and it almost always is on covers, to my knowledge, from the administrator's office. I don't know, by the way, how if you censored the contents, why you would then let it go on a boat and get a packet boat marking. I would have thought you would impound it and made sure it went into the mail, but I haven't got a satisfactory answer from that about that. Here's a nice cover with a censor number 2 label going to Bangkok, Thailand, and finally one with a number 3 label. There were just 3 censors with former New South Wales stamps, which are still relevant and in that period, and a postage registration label that shows Norfolk Island, New South Wales. So this is still the Australian stamp period. Some of the censoring covers were done elsewhere. This one was done in New Zealand. This one was done in Australia. Number 2 is Sydney, Australia. By now, the postage rate had been raised to 2.5 pennies. And so if you had a 2-penny stamp left over, you had to add a halfpenny kangaroo for censoring. During the war, New Zealand was responsible for the defense of many of the islands in the Pacific. And so a New Zealand contingent called N Force, and you'll see the N in the top right-hand corner of the right cover here. N Force was about 1,500 people, military people, probably not all soldiers, many engineers. They were sent to the island to build an airport. Because if you could get an airport on an air landing strip on Norfolk Island for the New Zealanders, that would make a great refueling stop on the way to the Solomon Islands and many other of the Pacific destinations that they needed to fly into during the Second World War. So the New Zealanders came in, built an airstrip that was started by the Australians, by the way, by New South Wales engineers, but finished by the New Zealanders. And the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, N-Force, then left, and the post office became APO 400. And when they left, it was given over to the Royal New Zealand Air Force, and it became a New Zealand Air Force post office. And these are the 3 main cancels. Also used during this period was the one in the bottom right-hand corner. That cancel was used all over the Pacific. And the only way you can determine whether it was used in Norfolk Island is by the censor mark, because we know certain censors were located on Norfolk Island. So this covers pretty much the New Zealand contingent. They did build the Air Force, the airstrip. It was completed in 43, or Christmas 42, the first plane landed. So it was completed while the war was going on. Australians were responsible for due north of Australia, for Papua New Guinea and that area. New Zealand was responsible for defense in the Pacific. After the war, we get an interesting pieces of mail. So this is May 1947, clearly a philatelic cover. The rate was, as I said, 2.5 pence, and this is a commercial cover into New South Wales with a Norfolk Island Ost.Cancel. The bottom cover in the right-hand corner here is actually very interesting. You'll notice it has an airmail sticker, and in fact, it's got the 2.5 penny stamp plus a 3 stamp paying for airmail. But there was no commercial air flights into Norfolk Island. The airstrip had been built, but twice a week, the New Zealand Air Force were running flights to and from Norfolk Island as they were mopping up after the Second World War. And civilian mail was allowed to be covered if they were carried, if there was space available on the New Zealand Air Force. So this cover was actually carried by the New Zealand Air Force to New Zealand, and then came on to Sydney, Australia after that. Final issues of the use of Australian stamps, the end of the Australian stamp period, occurred on Friday, the 6th of June, 1947, by which time we now had 3 different cancellations in use. The Ost with a dot, the Ost with a dot, the Ost without a dot, and the Ks were different. This K here comes out of this branch, and these Ks have a V on them. So there's all sorts of fun and games with which cancel is being used on which cover there. These were the last day covers. Now, why? Because Norfolk Island had been advocating for a long time that they needed additional revenues to run the island. And so they wanted a source of revenue. And finally, it was agreed that they could run their own affairs and their own postal service, and they were allowed to issue their own stamps as a revenue source. Here we have the end, all the 6th of June, 1947. Stamp collectors were into all of this by then, as you can see. This is a lovely cover, very clear, with the VK Norfolk and a registered, and it covers the registration and airmail period. Moving forward, we get to the first stamp issue. The first stamp issue, as you can see in the background here, that I've been carrying all along, is this picture. This is the publicity photograph for the picture on the left, and it shows Ball Bay in the foreground with Phillip Island in the background here. And this became known as the Ball Bay issue. And here is a first day cover of the issue with all of the stamps on the cover. And in fact, a blank registration label because they were no longer part of New South Wales. And you can see how close the picture here matches the publicity photo. And when I was there, I tried to get the same picture, and that's what it looks like. It's amazing. You can't even see another building. 75 years later, the scene looks almost as it did back then. I think this tree is probably this tree here. I couldn't get down down because there was a fence here, and this is private land down there. But the view doesn't look any different today, or Lend of 2019, than it did back in 1947 when the stamp issue was released. There were 2 cancellations used. There's a huge demand for first day covers for the stamp issue in 1947. 2 cancellations, they look very similar. They do not have a dot at the bottom, but one has what's called a narrow N here, which you can see in the Stanley Gibbons cover here, and a broad N here, which you can see in this cover going to New South Wales, Australia. Registered covers were done one of 3 ways. There was a blank with a very, very light cancellation. It's not just faded, it's slightly different. This is a blank label with a hand stamped Norfolk Island. And they used up some of the old Norfolk Island, New South Wales labels, but they crossed New South Wales out with a blue crayon because they weren't part of the New South Wales postal system anymore. There are also 3 different hand cancelled cachets that were used, and this is 2 of them. This is a 4-line one, and this is a 3-line one. And the other one will show up in a moment. The first survey flight, because they now have an airstrip, the first survey flight into Norfolk Island, commercial survey flight, was the 25th of September, 1947. And Qantas Airways flew into Norfolk Island, and this is from their first survey flight cover. This is the cover in. Then they decided that they could establish a regular weekly air service to Norfolk Island, and Norfolk Island would no longer just rely on passing ships for supplies. And so this is the inward cover of the first flight into Norfolk Island, signed by the captain. And this is the first Norfolk Island return cover to Sydney, also signed by the captain. The postage rate, 5.5 pence, because 2.5 pence for postage and 3 pence for air travel. You had to pay extra for the air travel. Here's a few uses of that first stamp, and I particularly put these in because you'll notice this one's coming to Canada in the top right-hand corner, and the bottom left-hand corner, this is going to Nova Scotia, and the bottom left-hand corner is going to Montreal. But this cover up in the top left is a little deceiving. You've got to look at it carefully. 2.5 pence for postage, 3 pence for airmail, and another 3 pence for registration, so the use of the 6-penny stamp. But if you look at the date, it's the 26th of September, 1947, and let's just go back to the previous slide. This first survey flight was done into Norfolk Island on the 25th of September, And this cover is the return flight from Norfolk Island to Sydney on the 26th of September. This is the first commercial flight out. It's the survey flight, first commercial flight out of Norfolk Island. Just some use of other stamps here. Again, remember 2.5 pence for postage, 3 pence for airmail, means that 5.5 pennies would be the amount required. Rates started to go up, by the way. The Australians started to raise the rates quite substantially around 1949, 1950. The Korean War and the inflation period, we'll see some higher rate covers. Very quickly, here's a couple more covers using that first Ball Bay issue set. I won't dwell on but here's another use of the Norfolk Island with the blue crayon cutting out New South Wales. Further, later covers, this is a late fee. Now, the post office closed, I think at 4, or maybe, I think it was at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It could have been 5. But as the mail was taken out to the airport, you could take your mail out to the airport to get the flight, remember weekly flights, and pay a 2-penny late fee to get your mail into the bag. And this late fee hand stamp was used for about a decade. So by now, by the time this period had come in, the postage rate had been raised to 3 halfpenny. So you have 3 halfpenny for the postage, 3 for the airmail, that's the 6 halfpenny, and then the 2-penny stamps paid the late fee. By 1954, air rates had gone up substantially. It was 2 shillings. And so this is an example of a use of the 2 shilling stamp. The first stamp issue was also used for coronation flights, and many of you will have seen these cachets in many times. This is the flight out of Norfolk Island to Great Britain. This is the flight from Great Britain into Norfolk Island. Here's the same cachet on an air letter, paying the 10-penny rate to London, to anywhere in the world at that stage. More uses of the first issue. But I will go past them fairly quickly. This one on the top is quite difficult, because in fact it is 6 halfpenny. It's the 3 halfpenny rate for postage plus 3 for airmail, and in fact that rate only lasted for 7 months, so it's a hard rate to get. And of course you can get nice covers with the packet boat cancels. Here we have British Solomon Islands cancel. Here we have New Hebrides cancel. These are all locations serviced by the MV Melita, and this is a Sydney packet boat cancel. Moving on to other stamps in the pre-decimal period. By 1953, a lot of the rates, because of the increasing rates in the early 50s, a lot of the stamps from the first issue were no longer valid, and you were constantly having to do makeups. And so they brought out new stamps to cover a lot of the new rates in 1953. Again, the use of the temporary registration label with the hand stamp, or they still using the old New South Wales with the blue crayon. But these all were designs from the convict heritage, plus the 6 halfpenny showed their airport. And these buildings are still, this is the governor's residence that's on the cachet and on this stamp. And you can see when I was there, I could take a photo that looked almost identical to the cachet image. And in fact, on the 10-penny was called the Salt House, where they salted the meat back in the early days. And the Salt House is still there and easy to walk up to and see. So these stamps represent monuments that are still there. I will show you examples of these other ones a little later. Air traffic was then extended to New Zealand, commercial air traffic. And Qantas subcontracted to Tasman Empire Airlines, which then became Air New Zealand. So this was the New Zealand to Norfolk Island first cover, and this is the Norfolk Island to New Zealand return flight. And it uses a mix of the stamp issues. The flight at this stage, airline, was 8 pennies. So it's a 6 halfpenny second issue combined with a 1 halfpenny first issue. These issues were available in what are called formula aerograms, formula letter cards, and this is just some examples of those items. The first commemorative issue really is this one celebrating the 100th anniversary of the landing of the Pitcairn Islanders. So we have a commemorative cancellation, 1856 to 1956, and cachets by the Australian Post Office, this one being registered. This one's by Guthrie, a stamp dealer in Western Australia, and this one's by Wesley Cover Service. It doesn't say first day cover, but it is. It just says souvenir cover. That would soon change. Wesley Cover Service would change their covers a little later on. Again, changing in rates meant that stamps had to be overprinted. It was hard to get contracts delivered on time to Norfolk Island. And so they took that 7-penny halfpenny stamp and overprinted at 7p, and the 8.5-penny stamp overprinted at 8p. This is a first day cover going to St. Helena. I think I like that location. And this is an example of the old stamp and the new stamp and the old stamp and the new stamp, sorry, the old stamp and the new stamp being used on a cover, and again, on a registered letter. But what's significant about this registered letter is it has its own registration level now. Norfolk Island, no longer any New South Wales underneath it or anything like that. The Ball Bay issues were phased out in 1959, and these two stamps, the commemorative stamps, basically the threepenny and 2 shilling, threepenny and 2 shilling, these became the workhorse commemoratives for a period after these were phased out. Again, Guthrie covers, just for the record. Again, in that pre-decimal period, you can find all sorts of neat stamps cancelled on Norfolk Island. Here's British Solomon Island stamps cancelled on Norfolk Island. These are New Hebrides stamps, clearly went through Norfolk Island. Then they started to get more into and Australia brought out a stamp issue for the 100th anniversary of the birth of the post office in 1959. And they reasoned that since Norfolk Island was under Australian jurisdiction, it also applied to the Norfolk Island post office. So they delayed bringing theirs out. And in the meantime, postage rates went from 4p to 5p. So Norfolk Island had to not only overprint Norfolk Island, but also the rate. So here's a first day cover, now called first day cover from the Wesley Cover Service, with the overprinted stamp. And here's a registered letter, formula registered letter using that stamp. Further overprinting had to take place along the way as the rates kept changing, and they needed new rates. And these are publicity photos, and here is an example of them used on a cover. And they finally brought in their own definitive set, if you like, of flower stamps in 1962, I think. And this set actually had a couple more higher values. But here you can see a flowers stamp used, cancelled in New Hebrides. Here's the 8-penny flower stamp paying the rate to New Guinea. And here's the 10-penny stamp, which was just a reuse of the Salthouse example, only this one's bicolor, paying the rate for an aerogram around the world. Here are the higher values. This one being sent to Goderich, Ontario. I like that. This one on a registered letter formula, and the high value, the 10 shilling. It is a first day of issue being sent to the USA, way overpaying what was necessary. It would have required a 2 and 8-penny stamp to the USA, which did exist, but they obviously decided to use this lovely 10 shilling stamp. Norfolk Island then started to get into the idea that it could issue its own stamps and more frequently and earn more revenue. So they took the Australian Christmas 1960 Christmas stamp and adapted it to a slightly different color, with the Norfolk Island, Australia being replaced by Norfolk Island, and issued their first Christmas stamp, a single. Ultimately, that became a series of 3 stamps as they tried to crank up their revenues. The 1961 Christmas stamp from Australia was adapted, and the color really changed for the Norfolk Island stamp. They got their own self-government in 1960. and issued a stamp for that event. Subsequently, in this pre-decimal period, before decimalization, they issued a series of fish stamps and a series of view stamps. They also had a stamp to commemorate Anzac, along with an omnibus issue with other Australian territories. And finally, in 1966, Australia went over to decimal currency, and they brought out a set of stamps, which it's the old set, but they're overprinted. There's a silver box, and then the number, it was overprinted twice. A silver box blocked out the old rate, and the new rate for in decimal currency was printed on top of that. And here we have the 4 high values coming to Stratford, Ontario on a first day of issue cover. And here we have the old Bloody Bridge, 5 shilling Bloody Bridge stamp, overprinted with 50 cents on the new one, with a registered Norfolk Island going to Germany. And this is an opportunity to just say, well, why is this called Bloody Bridge? Well, the overseer of the chain gang that was building the bridge in stone disappeared. And the chain gang said that he went for a swim and got washed out to sea. The ocean is just over the other side of this bridge. But indeed, in fact, the myth is, or maybe it's a fact, the myth is that the chain gang got him and cemented him into the bridge. And the argument was that, well, somebody claimed they saw blood coming out of the bridge, which verified that myth. But that's another example from the bloody period of the second settlement on Norfolk Island. And Bloody Bridge is still there. It still looks the same as it did. This is to December 2000, November 2019. It still looks exactly the same as it does in the stamp 75 years old. That was 66, so not quite, over 50 years later. Here's some use of the overprints, and a cover to Formosa, another cover to Halifax, Nova Scotia, a packet boat cover to England, and also the introduction of another Christmas stamp. And this you might think is ridiculous to show this. They're not addressed, they're clearly philatelic, but if you look at them, look at the cancel very carefully. It's a last day of issue cancel. How to generate more money from stamp collectors. Introduce not only a first day of issue cancel, but also a last day of issue cancel. You'll increase your revenues as a government, and you can pay for more roads and schools. So this was the first group of the overprint stamps that came out, and therefore this was the first one to be taken off on the 1st of April 1967. This was the second group to be taken off. This was the third group to be taken off in March 68, and the final group to be taken last day of issue in June 68. And in fact, the literature all says that the first use of the last day of issue cancel was this cancel, which is the same cancel on here, which was April 1967. But as I went through my material, I finally found a last day of issue for March 1967. The Christmas stamp came out in October 66. And in fact, it's about 5 months when they take them off use. And so this is about the right time. So this adds to the literature as the earliest last day of issue cancel that's out there. So even if you have some covers that you think look either ratty or boring or whatever, keep your eyes on the cancels. They might show up something interesting. And just here's an example of the continuation, the first day of issue cancel in June 69 and the last day of issue cancel a few months later on the right. Then Norfolk Island really got into it. They started to introduce more and more stamps. You have a stamp for Lions International. You have a couple of tourist type stamps. I like this cover, first day cover, but it's going to Port Moresby. Here's Norfolk Island pines in the background showing just how straight their brand and why you could see them making very good masts for ships. And then they introduced a series of vending machine stamps so that you could buy stamps outside the post office when the post office was closed. You can also get Cinderellas on Norfolk Island. And so this is the 21st anniversary of that commercial air service that Qantas had introduced, with a Cinderella available in Perth and used on covers. Signed by the same guy who 21 years previously had flown the flight into Norfolk Island, Captain Ambrose. I loved this little set that came out, but they were issuing definitive sets of 15 stamps every 2 years. Even though it's a very attractive set, 15 stamps is a little too many to be issuing every 2 years. But here's 3 covers using those stamps, 1 to New Zealand, 1 to Australia, 1 to the USA. And I do like that set, even though it's a big set. The next set came out just a little after, 1974. We had 16 what are called buildings. Again, a very attractive set. And while their stamp issues are proliferating, they are still at least keeping them to topics that are relevant to the island. Finally, they moved into stamps that showed the design of the island, like Tonga. They were used commercially. They weren't just sold to collectors. Then they got into big souvenir sheets and special cancellations. They issued a set of these types of stamps for the scouts and the guides. And then they got into the royal they got into more Cinderellas. And this was a commemoration of a 50th anniversary of a 1926 flight. And they got into special cancellations with the flight of the stamp. 3 different cancels exist, and you can see where the 2 is over the L to pick them out. Got on the bandwagon for Roland Hill, got on the bandwagon for US Centenary. These at least 4 scenes have something to do with Norfolk Island. This is the California quail, and the California quails are all over Norfolk Island to this day. So while they were related to California, they were imported to Norfolk Island. As I suggested earlier, Christmas sets became now sets of 3, not just sets of 1, again, to take more money out of the collector's pocket. Then they got on into the royalty game. The royal visit, and there's a whole story behind that, which I won't go into since I'm running over time. The 80th birthday, the 25th anniversary of Her Majesty's coronation, and of course, Di's wedding. They really got into the royalty game. And then bigger souvenir sheets. At least this one was issued jointly with Pitcairn Island. So there's the people leaving Pitcairn Island. There's the view of Pitcairn Island as they sailed away. This is the boat in the Mauritius that they came on. Then the Mauritius landed in Norfolk Island, and then they came off the boat and finally got to view the settlement that they were inheriting, the stone settlement from the settlement. So at least while it's a 6 stamp issued in total, at least it's relevant to the island. More special cancels, and then they got into aerograms and pre-stamped envelopes. And once again, pre-stamped envelopes look boring until you actually look at the cancellation. And this is the proper first day of issue cancellation. This is another, was used on another stamp. And you might notice that the little leg, the little stem on this Christmas tree does not exist on this one. This is an incorrect use of that cancel on this issue. But look at how bigger and gaudier the issues go. So I'm going to stop pretty soon on this part of it. They went to stamp shows, Anpex in Brisbane, 82, Aussiepex, 84, Stampex in Christchurch, New Zealand in 85. This is Stampex in 86 in Australia. And of course, the 86 Ameripex show. So I'm not saying these covers weren't commercially used. These pre-stamped envelopes weren't commercially used. They were commercially used. But in fact, the proliferation was just getting too much for most of us that collected the island. And so by the mid-80s, we stopped collecting. I'm going to finish very quickly now with a couple of little items. Local mail. Norfolk Island had a very interesting local mail service. When they started in 1947, they said that any local mail, they had a penny post. There is no mail delivery on Norfolk Island. There is one central post office in the main village, Burnt Pine. And so they got post office, everyone got a post office box. It was about 1,000 boxes, 2,000 people, 1,000 boxes plus businesses. And you got a post office box. So if you were mailing someone to someone else on the island or to a business on the island, you could go into the post office, hand the mail over the counter. The postmaster would put it in in the mailbox for that person, and you only had to pay a penny. And so there was a local mail service, a penny post. And here's one of the pre-decimal stamps, the penny pre-decimal stamps, 1965, going to William Burgess, Norfolk Island. Here is the 1 cent overprint, the provisional, doing the same thing. When they went to decimalization, the penny became a 1 cent one, and it's going to Post Office Box 85 on the island. And here's an example going to the same William Burgess, only now they've made it to his Post Office Box 91 on the island. And collecting these local mail covers is a lot of fun. Here's a 1 cent from that bird issue going to the Norfolk Island Hospital. Here's a 1 cent from the buildings issue from an insurance company. This one addressed to Grassy Road, and Grassy Road is not very long, but you don't have to attend, as you can see here and here, you don't have to have it addressed to a post office box number. This one goes to the Norfolk Island Bakery at Post Office Box 268. And if you're making up souvenir covers, it's a lot cheaper to only have to pay 1 cent to frank the covers. So it was a very useful rate to publicize Norfolk Island. Finally, if you forgot to put a stamp on it, then they did the double deficiency. You had to pay 2 cents for a tax. And so here's an example of a 2 cent stamp paying a tax. The penny post was eliminated, or not eliminated. It became a 5 cent post after July 1980, 16th of July 1980. This was the last day of the penny post, and then it became a 5 cent post. Finally, touch on official mail. Here's a very early official mail cover, Administrator's Office, 1944, used by the Post Office, 1947 for the Administrator's Office. Remember, this was the last day of issue of those stamps, Australian stamps, and then you can find the first issue used on the Register's Office, on His Majesty's Service from the Post Office in 1952, on Her Majesty's Service from the Post Office by 1960, and then you can look at other, and even these things which we would normally just throw out and put in the garbage, maybe better not say that, but the first one of these had a dot here, the second one had a dash here, and the most common third one had a star here, so you needed to keep your eyes on what you're doing. Miscellaneous, I always love these QSL cards. Australia had VK. The 9th region was for the territories Australia, and then the last two were usually in the initials of the operator, RH for Ray Hoare, and you can say NR for N Roberts, and the same thing, GM for George down here. It's a place that's easy to get lost. So you can have a whole little collection on missent covers. And so the Aussies missent it to the Solomon Islands. The Brits missent it to Pago, Samoa. The New Zealanders, who should have known better, saw Norfolk, figured it must be Norfolk, England, so they missent it to the United Kingdom. You can have a lot of fun picking up missent covers to Norfolk Island. Such a out-of-the-way place. Couple of final postcards. This is from the late Owen White, my real friend. He said, you should try and visit Norfolk Island sometime. And I did. I finally got there in 2019. And this one in the bottom right-hand corner, an incoming cover to Norfolk Island with a Papua New Guinea stamp, which I collect, going through a Thursday Island packet boat, which I also collect, as Mattia pointed out. So this is a great cover from me. Norfolk Island doesn't need any speed limits. They've got cows. The cows roam the roads all over the place because that is public property. This is the old common lands idea. The fences are to keep the cows out of your property, not to keep cows in. And so not surprisingly, now Norfolk Island stamps are produced by Australia. Australia took over running Norfolk Island in 2016. And so Norfolk Island stamps are now produced by Australia. Not surprising, cows feature in many of these stamps. Just to finish, and this is the final comment, Norfolk Island found that they raised lots of revenue through the 40s, 50s, 60s from stamp sales, from export and import duties, from radio licenses, TV licenses. But by the 70s, their expenditures were going up and the revenues were no longer going up. Stamp collecting plateaued, and so increasingly they started running deficits. And by the 2000s, the deficits were getting bigger and bigger, and Australia was bailing them out. And they finally came to Australia in mid-2015 and asked for a $12 million grant to bail them out. And Australia said, enough, we've had enough of this. The feature of Norfolk Island was it had no income tax. So people loved it because it had no income tax. Australia said, you've got to have an income tax or we're not bailing you out. You've got to raise your own revenues. And so apparently the council agreed to an income tax. And when they went to vote and agreed to it with Australia, Australia said they'd bail them out if they put in an income tax. But no councillor was willing to vote in front of their own people for an income tax. So the council actually voted against it when they'd already agreed to it with the Australians. And the Australians said, that's it, we're taking it over running of your territory. You're now an Australian territory, you don't have your own stamps anymore. And that's the way Norfolk Island is today, with their stamps having Australia, Norfolk Island on them. Sorry for running overboard, but over time, but there was lots to cover.